many Christians are iffy on watching the popular 8-season, decade-long series Game of Thrones for its portrayal of violence, gratuitous sex, and let's face facts, according to modern Christian morality, every behavior that sends people to hell. But under the surface, there is a fascinating world of different religions, belief systems, and movements that one cannot help but notice and compare to their own spirituality and religion today. Now, it is impossible to cover it all, so I expect the comment section to be loaded with additional ideas and talking points. That is great. And don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and check your notifications are turned on so you don't miss new stuff coming out. Even compared to the Judeo-Christian Middle Ages, we find a much less defined system of morality in Westeros, the main continent in Game of Thrones. This video is not designed to speak for or presume what the author of the books, George R.R. Martin, may be attempting to say with his writing about the faiths of the Seven Kingdoms and the fascinating world he has created in his novels. This video is a subjective comparison with well-thought-out speculations designed to find parallels and contrast comparisons. Martin has revealed in interviews his affinity for some Norse mythology. While it is important to remember that the Game of Thrones books and miniseries are fantasy, Martin did create a very detailed world, filled in even further by superfans that cleaned up much of the history, timelines, and nomenclature. Martin has continued to tie up loose ends on some stories. The characters in Game of Thrones are deep, and with long character arcs. Martin breaks the conventional storytelling model of the hero, villain, and protagonist, while still paying homage to those classic, desirable narratives. Viewers must go into this project with an open mind. We are not going to be judging the work morally by comparing it to modern non-fiction religious belief systems. Instead, we're going to have some fun and, spoiler alert, come up with potential ideas about the show's end from these ideas. The perspective I hope we can view from is, how do the beliefs of the audience watching the show compare and contrast the complicated world of the Seven Kingdoms? Now, let's establish some background on Westeros and a few areas beyond. The religious and belief systems that define the place. 6,000 years ago, the Andals and the First Men brought the faith of the Seven to Westeros. In time, the Seven came to represent one god with 7 different aspects. Those aspects included the most common virtues, and in some cases, defects. First Men brought the faith of the Seven, represented by a 7-pointed star tunic on their clothes or belongings. Some maesters said the Seven were living people at some point. It is interesting when compared to Trinitarian Christianity, Father, Son, and Spirit, 3 entities, attributes, aspects, or phases of one God. The 7 refer to the Mother, who represents mercy, fertility, and peace. The Father, who represents justice. The Warrior, who represents protection, skill in battle, and valor. The Crone represents wisdom and foresight. The Smith represents creation. The Maiden represents purity, love, and beauty. The Stranger represents death and is rarely prayed to. As a quick aside, I've wondered about what I think is a fan theory I have not seen elsewhere, that at the end of Season 8, in the TV series, 7 characters representing each of these attributes might come to rule the 7 kingdoms by republic together. Try to identify the main characters as each one of the 7. It is fairly easy to see the attributes of the 7 in many of the characters. Prayers to the 7 are portrayed at various times in the series. sometimes at mealtimes. For example, when the Hound, Sandor Clegane, and Arya Stark are eating dinner with a father and daughter in the Riverlands, who had been kind enough to take them in. The prayer goes through each of the attributes seeking a blessing over their meager meal. One further allusion is in the greeting people share in Westeros. They often will say, 7 blessings to you. Not everyone followed the 7. Back when the Andals, the first men, brought the faith to Westeros during their invasion of the continent, the northern families held to what they called the Old Gods, beliefs inherited from the Children of the Forest. The children were the inhabitants of Westeros before the first men invaded. Although back then it was more forest than castles and medieval infrastructure, they worshipped nameless, faceless gods of the forest. A representation of what modern theology would call secondary causation, finding divinity in the wind, trees, storms, rain, animals, and nature in general. They represented their gods by carving their faces into an increasingly rare tree called a weirwood tree. The books may make some allusion to the Children of the Forest as the first pure version of some form of sapiens, living off nature as an archetype of aboriginals. The undertone of innocence and a simpler time may cause some viewers to think toward the idea of Eden or paradise, as portrayed in the book of Genesis in the Bible. When the Children of the Forest were hunted to near extinction and pushed further north, they held to the old gods. Many of the first men who settled in the north maintained their allegiance to the old gods centuries after having conquered Westeros. Many northern castles kept an area of old forest protected by high walls inside the grounds of the castles called a godswood, with a weirwood tree at its center. Whereas the 7 seem to be representation of humanity's assets and defects of character, the old gods, which make no claim to be a representation of one entity and therefore may be viewed as polytheism, seem to have some supernatural elements to it. The trees themselves seem to hold the conscious memories of all of human history. In time, just like in Holy Scripture, the children of Adam, like the children of the forest, fall to the warring ways of first men, with their strange gods and overpowering violence. In order to protect their dwindling numbers, the children of the forest somehow made the first White Walker by driving a shard of obsidian, dragon glass, into the heart of a human, thus animating him as a dead creature with the attributes of a living human, to protect them from the encroaching Andals. The Stark family of Winterfell, one of Game of Thrones' most important, seem to have some supernatural powers themselves. In the books, several have warging abilities and can see through the minds of other creatures. Brandon Stark takes his gift further and becomes the three-eyed raven. The raven serves as the memory of human history that could otherwise be forgotten. He can see past, present, and future, everywhere and everything. Early in the story, 6 direwolf pups are born and adopted by the Stark children. Thought to be extinct, the direwolves are bigger than any other breed and have long served as the design of the sigil of House Stark. The emergence of the pups is viewed as a sign by the superstitious people with their own prophecies and foretelling about the long night to come. Uncle Benjen Stark, first ranger of the Night's Watch, the elite team charged with guarding Westeros' northernmost border wall from enemies, both natural and supernatural, is stabbed with an ice spear by a White Walker, one of the army of the dead. A regular human, once deceased, reanimated by the touch of a White Walker to pursue the Night King's mission of turning the living into dead men thus erasing the memory of humanity for all time. Benjen Stark is alive, though. His death is interrupted by the Children of the Forest, who used dragon glass plunged into his heart. This stopped him from dying, but placed limitations on where he could go, a sort of limbo between the living and the dead. The event seems to have left part of his soul intact in his otherwise animated body. Benjen's nephew and steward of the Night Watch, Jon Snow, is stabbed 7 times and killed by his own men, but is brought back to life by either a Red Witch's incantations or the transfer of the spirit of his direwolf into his body. The TV series is not specific on that point. Surely comments will fill below to clarify this. The Red Witch practices yet another religion. She follows the Lord of Light. Fire is the main attribute of this god. It appears to the modern eye as a representation of what was Puritan Christian stereotypes. Lots of people were burned. Idols and traditions of old past gods being destroyed. The use of blood and leeches to mark individuals for death. The use of demons to commit murder. One thinks of the warnings in the Bible that identify Satan as masquerading as a being of light. It appears that the Lady Melisandre, the Red Priestess serving the Lord of Light, believed human sacrifices had a secondary direct causation. In other words, God would reward them with favorable weather, guide the outcome of battles, and grant the power to take lives of those deemed as enemies without physically touching them, in return for human sacrifices burned at the stake. This has interesting similarities to certain pre-Judean Canaanite religions as well, and others to be sure. The lands of the East also seem to have had their own distinct belief systems built on combinations of idolatry and the worship of human attributes embodied in animals or statues that allegedly controlled unseen forces. Yet again, modern morals don't seem to factor into those religions in the way that we know them today. A group of characters modeled after what seem to be native tribes of the Great Plains called the Dothraki, largely nomadic hunter-gatherers with a social currency of violence, pillaging, and ravishing those who would pleasure them. They too have a holy place, the city of Vaes Dothrak. In the city, the Dothraki do not carry weapons, conceivably not to shed blood, although one could be killed with bare hands and not violate the standard. The Dothraki venerate the horse as spirit and life. The religions in the East, for the most part, venerate animals via idols, and the religions in the West worship and deify human attributes. Resurrection factors heavily into some of the belief systems. Certain individuals have been brought back to life by the Lord of Light, at least it appears that way. Sir Beric Dondarrion is resurrected 9 or more times. The Red Witch, Melisandre, performs a ceremony on Jon Snow to resurrect him. Interestingly, these seem to be the only 2 characters resurrected that maintain their souls, personality, and humanity, even though the Lord of Light seems to demand human sacrifice. When Daenerys Targaryen's husband, Khal Drogo, is dying from an infection, she agrees to use blood magic to save him against the judgment of her counselors. In these rituals, only death pays for life. Daenerys tries to get around the need for a human sacrifice and slices Khal Drogo's horse above him as the blood sprays him. At the same time, the child Daenerys holds in her stomach, the son of Khal Drogo, is miscarried and leaves the womb early as some form of monster. Drogo does reanimate, but only in the context of being physically animated. He cannot speak, think, or feel. It is as if his body was reanimated without a soul. The warrior, Sir Gregor Clegane, also called the Mountain, meets a similar fate when his trial by combat against Oberyn Martell finds him gravely wounded. Stabs and cuts by a Dornish longspear laced with manticore venom. His reanimated body lacks the same spirit and life that left Khal Drogo almost zombie-like. Unlike the death of Khal Drogo, Clegane's reanimation of life seems to have had more to do with some science or alchemy than religion or prayer. The disgraced Maester Qyburn experiments on him much as we see Dr. Frankenstein do to his monster. For the most part, the faith of the Seven is the dominant religion in Westeros. We see parallels to clericalism in the interactions between the faith and the crown in King's Landing. In real life, clericalism bureaucratized the ecumenical churches such as Catholicism, Episcopal, and Methodist, to the point that they were operating much more in the frame of the amoral bureaucracy and less on the moral foundation of a Christian faith. Who knows if that was George Martin's intention when writing, but one can't escape seeing the Sept of Baelor as a sort of Vatican, and the High Septons, Septons, and Scepters as religious clergy, full of hypocrisy for all to see. They are active in politics. On one hand, they house orphans and feed the poor, and on the other hand, they turn to extremism and violence when dealing with dissent. Violence and murder in the name of their god is fully justified and backed by King Tommen Baratheon and the Queen Regent, Cersei Lannister. The commoners even seemed to get behind the Sept during the times that he, or the Sparrows as they were sometimes called, made the rich and royal targets for sin and desperate repentance. Another faith that lies across the narrow sea but has impact on the rest of the world is the many-faced god, served by the faceless men. It is easy to see the many-faced god as a form of monotheism. They acknowledge the representations of other gods worldwide as mere representations of the many-faced god. One god, many faces. The many-faced god is death. Only life can pay for death. The faceless men ritualize the assisted suicide and outright murder of many, and in turn use the faces of the dead as skins to conceal themselves to carry out murders for the many-faced god. Over on the Iron Islands of Westeros, the drowned god is worshipped by the Greyjoys, much like the storm god in the Stormlands by the Baratheons. An aspirant for king on the Iron Island participates in a strange baptism-like event where they are literally drowned, brought out of the water, and laid on the beach. If they cough up the salt water, they are reborn, the Iron Way, and become king. In comparing these systems to Christianity, there are important parallels. Care for orphans, widows, feeding the poor, spreading the message of the one true God, and resurrection. This may also be one of the more fascinating story arcs in Game of Thrones. First of all, resurrection seems to have nothing to do with morality in Game of Thrones. The two resurrectees who maintained most of their identities, Jon Snow and Beric Dondarrion, have no idea why God saw fit to bring them back. While some characters may deserve to live based on our modern moral standards, the resurrection of men and women in Westeros don't seem to be based on merit or spiritual wellness. Further, the resurrections range in how they are done and why. Beric Dondarrion was a knight of the Seven Kingdoms who happened to come across a drunken man who sincerely prayed from his heart for Beric to live, and he did. His own brothers killed Jon Snow as a traitor. If there is a Jesus parallel, there may be some here. It has the he died for his people type narrative, and some fans have speculated the timeline for his death and resurrection to be 3 days, like Jesus. He is resurrected with seemingly the same soul and personality. Perhaps he had killed the boy and become the man, as the Maester of Castle Black, Aemon Targaryen, told him. Another interesting narrative with some loose biblical and mythological parallels occurs surrounding the dwindling population of giants. In the narrative and TV series, there is a small population of giants left that have slowly been dying off at the hands of men and resulting from war with them. Now only a few remain. The giants, just like dragons, White Walkers, and everything supernatural, have been dormant or so far away for so long that modern history has replaced the once natural realities of the world with nihilism and skepticism that leaves most believing the stories about White Walkers to be fables. Yet increasingly, as the White Walkers move south and more people see them, and as the wildlings move further south, flanked by the remaining giants, more and more people report them as real. This view parallels the modern nihilism about the Bible: secularism, institutional naturalism, moral relativism, materialism. It compelled many to simply refuse to respect biblical writing as authentic and regard past events of ancient history as downgrades to fable and mythology. The giants in Game of Thrones are presented as primitive and destroyed by the civilization of men, whereas in Scripture the giants had the upper hand in guiding man toward advanced knowledge with which to expand civilization. In the Bible, the giants helped without God's permission, making man far beyond what God intended and placing them at odds with the natural world, and they were punished. In Westeros, the giants are all but extinct, save for a handful that fight alongside the first men periodically as a means of their own survival. Over time, they were pushed further and further north. For that matter, the same biblical allusion can be seen in the way the children of the forest are on a long-term decline because of the migrating, living patterns and consumption patterns of men. According to the earlier species living in the north, men are at odds with the natural order, represented by the children of the forest stemming from man's first violence. In Game of Thrones, eat, drink, and be merry seems to be the only morals known by the upper gentry of characters. The concept of morals as governing principles seem foreign, even foolish. Ned Stark's ignorance of politics and desire to place cold, hard truth above it led directly to his own execution. Of course, he had faults too, but they were a far cry from the debauchery of King's Landing. At the same time, individual characters have arcs that see them rise, fall, suffer, and find redemption. We see this over and again. Most often it has nothing to do with one's religious choice. Many of the main characters are religious because of the traditions of their respective houses, but do not seem to have a guiding set of morals from it by the traditional sense. In other words, one's religion does not seem to offer a guiding sense of principle by which to live daily life. Religion is the feather in the cap of those who attend court in the throne room, but do not see the influence of daily decisions in the realm. Because of this, honor or code is largely subjective, different from person to person. For example, at one point, Sandor Clegane has no problem killing a young child for no reason other than the king's lusts and embarrassments, but won't steal, saying, "A man's got to have a code." He goes on a short time later to strike a good man down and steal his silver, making the shockingly compelling argument that the man was weak and could not care for his daughter. Therefore, Clegane just put them out of their misery quicker. Jaime Lannister is sleeping with his sister and pushes the 10-year-old Stark boy who sees them from a high window in the hopes he would die and keep his perverted secret. Yet another time, when a group of men try to force themselves on Jaime's captor and traveling companion, Brienne of Tarth, he talks an elaborate scheme to save her from her humiliating fate of being raped, and has his own hand chopped off in the process. Perhaps the prominent arc of sin, fall, brokenness, confession, and redemption belongs to Theon Greyjoy. He betrays his family, fakes the death of his brothers, steals their home, attacks and kills those who helped raise him, gets captured, tortured, castrated, allows his sister to be captured, but eventually finds bravery in his heart and the peace of proudly being both Greyjoy and Stark. Jon Snow demonstrates steady leadership and joins the Night's Watch. He breaks his vow to have sex with a woman, but takes other vows to the extreme. He makes unprecedented decisions in leadership and is killed for them and resurrected. Out of several characters brought back from the dead, Snow seems to be the most normal after his return. Khal Drogo clearly doesn't have a soul afterward. And the Mountain, resurrected by the science of Qyburn, does not have a spiritual component. Death is separate from morality, which points to the reality that death comes for the good and wicked. The hope for the good is an afterlife. However, those brought back to life by the so-called Lord of Light report seeing nothing, no consciousness. Christianity, on the other hand, which can serve as a tool for the arc of personal development, does have a hope for an afterlife. Game of Thrones is fantasy after all, but even by the Middle Ages, real-life Christians had a high sense of morality generally. Game of Thrones may be more about the corrupting effects of power and the impact of class structure. If we are looking at medieval Christianity as a lens for Game of Thrones, it does not seem to work. If we are looking at Machiavelli's timeless work, The Prince, we see a lot more similarity. Although Machiavelli would have lived over 1,000 years after Game of Thrones is set, the writer George Martin and the show's writers have given viewers something worthwhile to consider in this series. By its moral ambiguity, it shows us and allows us to ask ourselves what we would do in these situations. Jaime Lannister, the Kingslayer, a traitor who killed the king he was supposed to guard and protect, even though the Mad King threatened to kill 500,000 people with wildfire and asked Jaime to bring the king his own father's head. What would we do? During the Red Wedding, nearly the entire Stark line was killed, and the War of the Five Kings for the Iron Throne died with it. Tywin Lannister points out it was more humane to murder 20 people at a wedding than have a war continue that would see tens of thousands dead. What would we do? Lord Varys and King Robert Baratheon asked us to consider if it was more moral to kill the last Targaryen heir, a little baby girl, or wait until she was full-grown adult with armies that could go to war where thousands would die. What would we do? It is hard to find any modern parallels to religion today in Game of Thrones, particularly Christianity. Almost every character does heinous things without any deference or humility. The gods seem to be totally separate from morality, yet aren't their actions our own if we are self-honest? The whole exercise should make us appreciate the pathway Christianity offers us in our day-to-day lives. In the end, Cersei Lannister says it best of all when her brother Tyrion mentions to her that Sansa Stark does not deserve the fate of having to marry him, a Lannister, after they murdered so many of the Stark family. Queen Cersei says, "Be careful working out what people deserve. Soon enough you will mourn for everyone. There will be no one left to mourn for." She points directly to John Calvin's doctrine of man's total depravity. If there is a link to Christianity, it is this: we are all sinners who daily fall short of God's grace. In the end, Brandon Stark, as the three-eyed raven, holds the memories of human history. The Night King of the White Walkers is coming for him. If death is the end and all are to die, what better way to end humanity by killing its memories? Forgetting the dead is, in fact, the death of mankind and the stories. This follows the same logic as early pagan faiths around the time Christianity was formed. In order that the dead might not be forgotten, Roman citizens would enter their catacombs one day each year as a family with food and fellowship to remember their dead and tell stories so that their memories might live on. Good and evil are blurred and more realistic to human nature. People are mixes of good and bad. Some can find redemption and become whole. Institutional clericalism is no different than the crown and her Machiavellian motives. In the end, if the Night King succeeds in wiping out every vestige of humans and their grand design, much like the Bible shows us in the story of Noah, the perfect earth, free of sinful, destructive humans, ready anew to begin again, it sure is a lot to think about.